The early morning mist hung thick in the air as the distant roar of battle echoed across the field. It was a sound that would soon define the life of a young warrior. Yet at that moment, no one could have known just how far-reaching the consequences of this day would be. The ground trembled beneath the feet of soldiers, both allies and enemies alike, as the sun broke over the horizon, casting a golden light on a scene that would change the course of history forever. In the chaos of battle, there was one figure who stood resolute amid the storm. He was a king in waiting, a warrior whose resolve had been forged in the fires of conflict. Yet, despite his strength, there was something undeniably human about him, something that would make his story one of the most unlikely and awe-inspiring in history. He had not yet claimed his throne, nor had he fully realized the immense weight of what he was about to undertake. But in this moment, standing at the precipice of greatness, the young monarch knew only that he must fight. Fight for survival, for legacy, and for the future of a kingdom that had been forgotten by time. As the battle raged on, the world around him became a blur of iron and blood, the deafening clash of weapons filling the air. Yet, through it all, he remained focused, eyes locked onto his goal. His men fought with a desperation born of knowing that this was not merely a battle for land or power. It was a battle for identity, for survival. The future of the kingdom hung in the balance, and its destiny rested on the shoulders of a warrior who, though young, carried the weight of an entire people's hopes and fears. It was not the first time he had fought in such a battle. The young monarch had been forged in countless skirmishes, each one a test of his ability to lead, to inspire, and to outwit his enemies. But there was something different about this day. There was something in the air, something that whispered of destiny. The odds were insurmountable, the enemy far stronger, their numbers overwhelming. Yet, the monarch's resolve did not waver. His heart, his courage, and his sharp mind kept him steady. He knew that if he faltered here, all would be lost, not just for him, but for those who depended on him. As he moved through the battlefield, his sword flashing in the sunlight, the warrior's mind raced. His training, his instincts, everything he had learned up to this point came to the forefront. He was not a man driven by blind ambition. He was a man driven by a deeper, more profound sense of duty. The kingdom he fought for was not just his. It was the culmination of generations of sacrifice, struggle, and hope. To fail now was to dishonor the legacy of his ancestors and deny the future of his people. He would not allow that to happen. In the midst of the fray, a sudden shift in the battle caught his attention. A flank, once secure, began to crumble under the weight of enemy forces. The young monarch's pulse quickened, and without hesitation, he rode toward the front lines, rallying his men with a voice that cut through the chaos. He wasn't just a leader. He was the embodiment of their hopes, their very reason for continuing the fight. As his soldiers fell into formation behind him, their fear turned into resolve. They trusted him with their lives, their future. He charged into the heart of the enemy, his blade cutting through the air with precision and fury. Every strike was not just an act of war, but an act of survival. Each movement, each decision, was a step towards something greater. A future where his people would no longer live in fear, where they would no longer be at the mercy of foreign invaders or corrupt rulers. The world around him seemed to slow, and for a moment, it felt as though the battle had become a test of will, of fate itself. Then, as if the gods themselves had chosen this moment to intervene, the tide of the battle began to turn. The monarch's forces, inspired by his courage, rallied and struck back with renewed vigor. The enemy, caught off guard by the sudden shift, faltered. It was a small victory in the grand scope of things, but it was enough. In that moment, the young warrior realized something that would shape the course of his life. Victory was not determined by the strength of one man, but by the strength of the vision he could inspire in others. As the battle wore on, the young monarch's mind remained clear, his resolve unbroken. He knew that even as the immediate threat was pushed back, the war was far from over. This was just the beginning. But for the first time, he could see the path ahead. The kingdom, the empire he would one day forge, would not be built through blind conquest or ruthless tyranny. It would be built through unity, through inspiring those who followed him to believe in something greater than themselves. With the battlefield finally clearing, the young monarch stood amidst the carnage, his sword stained with the blood of his enemies. But there was no sense of triumph in his heart, no celebration of victory. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, a deep and unshakable realization of the cost of what he had just achieved. The war was not won. The future was not secured. And yet, there was something deeply stirring in the air, something that felt like the beginning of a journey that would change the course of history. The young warrior knew that this was only the first step, and the road ahead would be long, filled with challenges, betrayals, and sacrifices. But it was a road that he was willing to walk, no matter the cost. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. The monarch's rise to power had begun in the fires of war, but it would not end there. His destiny would unfold in ways that no one, least of all him, could yet imagine. In the silence that followed the battle, as the smoke began to rise from the fields, he stood tall, his heart resolute. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty, but he also knew that he was destined for something greater. A warrior's journey was never easy, but it was always worth it. The young monarch was no longer just a man in the midst of a battle. He was a force of destiny, and the world would soon learn the true cost of underestimating him. As he turned away from the battlefield, the weight of what lay ahead began to settle in. The journey would be long, the sacrifices would be many, and the battles would be countless. But in that moment, he understood something fundamental. He was not fighting for power alone. He was fighting for something far more meaningful. The future of his people, the restoration of his kingdom, and the creation of a legacy that would endure long after his own time had passed. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the vast, untamed land that stretched out before him. As a child, he had spent countless hours running through the fields, feeling the wind whip through his hair and dreaming of a world that was far beyond the reach of his humble origins. But those carefree days were behind him now. He was no longer a child, no longer the boy who played in the dirt with his friends or listened to the stories of old men in the village tavern. He was something more, a young man, marked by fate and burdened with a destiny that few could understand. Born to a family of little renown, his early years were shaped not by grandeur, but by the harsh realities of life on the fringes of the kingdom. His father, a man of modest means, worked the land with stoic determination. His mother, a woman of quiet strength, instilled in him the values of honor, duty, and resilience. They were simple people, driven by the rhythms of the seasons and the struggle to survive. There were no grand aspirations, no promises of a kingdom or empire. There was only the land, the family, and the unspoken understanding that the world beyond their small home was a place of both opportunity and danger. For much of his early life, the young warrior had been content to live in the shadow of his family's modest station. He had learned to work the fields, to tend to the animals, and to live in harmony with the land. There was peace in the simplicity of these tasks, a quiet satisfaction in the routine. But even in those moments of peace, a restlessness stirred within him, a sense that there was something more, something he was destined to become. It was the stories that his father told him at night that first planted the seed of ambition. His father, though a humble farmer, had once fought in the king's army. His tales of distant lands, epic battles, and heroes who had risen from nothing to become legends fascinated the young boy. He listened intently, imagining himself in the boots of those warriors, standing tall against the forces of evil, leading his people to victory. The stories were more than just tales of glory. They were blueprints for a life that could be lived differently. His father spoke of honor, of sacrifice, and of the power of a man's will to change the world. Those words stuck with him, lodged in his heart like an arrow. But it was not just the tales of battle that shaped him. There was something in the way his mother looked at him when she spoke of the future, something in her eyes that suggested she knew he was destined for more than a simple life on the farm. Her silence was as powerful as any words could have been. She saw the fire in him, the same fire that burned in her husband, and perhaps she saw something else, something beyond what anyone could have guessed. She knew he would not stay. She knew that the boy who played in the dirt and dreamed of distant lands would one day become the man who would shape the destiny of an entire kingdom. As he grew older, the young monarch became restless. The peace of his home, the quiet stability of his village, began to feel suffocating. His dreams of adventure, of greatness, could no longer be contained by the confines of his family's farm. The world beyond beckoned him, and he felt a pull, a magnetic force that urged him to venture into the unknown, to test his mettle, to see if he truly had the strength to carve a path for himself. It was not long before the opportunity to leave came. A passing mercenary band, traveling through the region, made camp near the village. They spoke of battles fought far from home, of gold and glory, and of kingdoms that had risen and fallen. To the young warrior, they were living embodiments of the stories his father had told him. He watched them with awe as they sharpened their weapons and prepared for the road ahead. He knew, without a doubt, that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The decision to leave was not easy. His parents, though understanding of his ambitions, tried to dissuade him. They spoke of the dangers that awaited him beyond the safety of the village, of the harsh realities of war and conflict. His father, with a somber expression, warned him that the path of a warrior was fraught with peril and loss. But there was no stopping the young monarch. He had already made up his mind. He was going to leave, to find his place in the world, to prove that he was more than just the son of a farmer. When the time came to say goodbye, there were no grand speeches, no tearful farewells. He simply kissed his mother on the cheek, shook his father's hand, and left without looking back. There was no hesitation in his step, no doubt in his heart. He knew that this was the only way forward, the only way to fulfill the purpose that had been planted within him. He was ready. The road ahead was difficult and unforgiving. He joined the mercenaries, and for the first time in his life, he tasted the bitter reality of war. The battles were brutal, the men cold and hardened, and the world far darker than he had ever imagined. The young monarch quickly learned that survival required more than just physical strength. It required cunning, adaptability, and an unyielding resolve. In the chaos of battle, he began to understand what it truly meant to lead, to inspire loyalty, and to make decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. The mercenary life was not kind to him, but it was where he forged the skills that would one day define him. He became proficient in swordplay, strategy, and the art of warfare. More importantly, he learned to read people, to understand their motives, and to see the world not as a series of black and white choices, but as a complex web of interconnected actions and consequences. These lessons, though hard-earned, would serve him well when the time came to rise to power. It was during this time that the young monarch encountered the first true test of his leadership. In the midst of a brutal skirmish with a rival mercenary band, his commander was gravely injured, leaving the young warrior with a choice: lead the men to victory or let them fall into chaos. There was no time to hesitate. The young monarch took command, rallying the mercenaries with a calm, steady voice that cut through the noise of the battle. His words, though simple, carried weight. They believed in him, followed him without question. Under his leadership, the mercenaries fought with renewed vigor, and the tide of the battle turned in their favor. Afterward, as the dust settled and the wounded were tended to, the young monarch stood among the survivors, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. He had led them to victory, yes, but at a great cost. The price of war was always high, and he had begun to understand the true consequences of his choices. It was no longer about glory or personal ambition. It was about the lives of those who followed him, the lives that depended on him. And in that moment, he understood the gravity of his path. He was no longer just a boy with a dream. He was a leader, a man who would shape the future with every decision he made. As the days turned into months, the young monarch continued to grow. He fought in battles, led men, and learned the intricacies of power. The experiences he had in the mercenary band shaped him into a warrior of remarkable skill, But it was the lessons of leadership and loyalty that truly set him apart. He began to see the world through a different lens, one where the price of victory was measured not just in blood, but in the souls of those who fought beside him. The road ahead was still long, and the future uncertain, but there was no turning back now. The young monarch had found his calling, and he was prepared to walk the path to greatness, wherever it might lead. The cold morning air bit at his skin as the young monarch stood on the precipice of a new chapter in his life. The battlefield stretched out before him, a vast expanse of churned earth and scattered bodies, the aftermath of yet another clash that had brought him one step closer to his ultimate goal. The smoke from the fires lingered in the air, a heavy reminder of the devastation that war left in its wake. It had been years since he had first set foot on the path of a warrior, years since he had felt the pull of destiny urging him forward. But even now, standing at the edge of this chaotic landscape, the weight of his journey was not lost on him. He had come a long way from the boy who once dreamed of glory in the quiet fields of his home. Now, he was a man, hardened by the struggles he had endured, shaped by the battles he had fought, and fueled by an unshakable resolve to carve out a legacy that would last for generations. His army, though not large by the standards of more established kingdoms, had grown under his leadership. He had earned the loyalty of his men through sheer determination, his uncanny ability to turn the tides of battle with strategic brilliance, and his unwavering commitment to their cause. They fought not just for land or power, but for him because they believed in him. He had proven himself time and again on the battlefield, and in doing so, he had begun to reshape the perception of what it meant to be a leader. No longer was he simply a warrior. He was a commander, a tactician, someone who understood that victory was not always won by brute force alone, but through the careful application of strategy and the art of war. Yet, despite the victories that had piled up in his wake, there was a quiet, persistent sense of unease within him. He had won battles, yes, but the real test, the true challenge, was still to come. The kingdom that he sought to reclaim was not just an entity of land and wealth. It was a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and power struggles that stretched back centuries. The young monarch had come to understand that war was not simply fought with swords and shields. It was fought in the hearts and minds of men. His true test would not be to defeat an enemy on the battlefield, but to secure his position as ruler, to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, to outmaneuver those who would seek to undermine him. The first cracks in his power began to show when he made his bold move to march toward the capital. The news of his approach sent ripples of fear and excitement through the kingdom. Some saw him as a liberator, a hero who would restore justice and order to a land ravaged by corruption and decay. Others saw him as a usurper, a threat to the established order who would plunge the kingdom into chaos. The nobles, once indifferent to his rise, now began to take notice. Whispers of rebellion started to spread, and rival factions began to stir. There was a sense in the air, thick and palpable, that the fragile peace of the kingdom was about to be shattered. The young monarch understood that the road to the throne was not a straight path, and that his victory on the battlefield would mean little if he could not secure the loyalty of those who wielded true power, the lords and ladies who controlled vast lands, wealth, and influence. He had fought for years with the conviction that the strength of his army and the purity of his cause would be enough to carry him to the capital. But now he realized that his true challenge would be in navigating the labyrinth of politics and intrigue that lay ahead. It was not long before the first signs of internal strife began to surface. The nobles, whose loyalty he had once assumed to be unshakable, began to question his intentions. They were wary of a warrior king, a man who had risen from humble beginnings to challenge the established order. They saw in him both a threat and a potential ally, and they were unsure of how to respond. Some pledged their support, drawn to his charisma and the promise of a better future under his rule. Others, however, saw his rise as an affront to their power, and they began to conspire against him in the shadows, sowing seeds of dissent that would threaten to undermine everything he had worked for. The monarch's first real test as a leader came not in battle, but in the chambers of his own court. The nobles who had once hailed his victories now turned their eyes on him with suspicion. The alliances he had forged with them were fragile, and the slightest misstep could shatter them. The delicate balance of power that he had worked so hard to build was beginning to unravel, and he found himself caught between competing factions, each one vying for influence, each one eager to take advantage of his perceived weakness. He knew that his greatest asset was not the strength of his army, but the loyalty of his people. And so, he turned his attention inward, focusing on consolidating power and ensuring that the kingdom remained united in the face of external and internal threats. His ability to inspire and command respect from his men was unparalleled, but he realized that he could not win this war alone. He needed to navigate the shifting allegiances of the nobility to outmaneuver his rivals without alienating potential allies. It was a delicate dance, one that required both patience and cunning, and it was one that he would have to learn quickly if he was to succeed. As the days passed, the young monarch's resolve was tested like never before. The pressure of leadership weighed heavily on him, the constant demands of his army and his court threatening to overwhelm him. But even in the midst of the turmoil, he found a sense of clarity. He understood that the true nature of power was not in the ability to command armies or wield swords. It was in the ability to inspire, to unite, and to lead with wisdom. He had fought to get to this point, but now he had to fight to keep it. He had to prove that he was more than just a warrior. He was a king in the making. The key to his survival, he realized, lay in his ability to adapt. The battlefield had taught him the importance of flexibility, of understanding the ever-changing dynamics of war. Now, he applied those lessons to the political landscape of the kingdom. He learned to listen as much as he spoke, to read the subtle signs of loyalty and betrayal in the eyes of his advisors. He cultivated relationships with key figures, some of whom would become his closest allies, others who would remain dangerous enemies. He became a student of diplomacy as much as he had been a student of war. But despite all his efforts, the young monarch could not shake the sense that the storm clouds were gathering. His enemies were growing bolder, and his once strong alliances began to fray. The question of legitimacy, whether he had the right to rule, whether he had earned the trust of the people, became the focal point of the growing rebellion. His army, though still loyal, was not immune to the doubts that had begun to creep into the minds of the nobles. His legitimacy was questioned not just on the battlefield, but in the very heart of the kingdom, where power was not simply a matter of might, but of perception. And yet, even as the pressure mounted, the young monarch stood firm. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, and that the battles he fought would be as much about maintaining his grip on power as they were about conquering new lands. But he also knew that this was the test he had been waiting for, the test of his true leadership. If he could navigate these treacherous waters, if he could emerge victorious from the tangled web of politics and intrigue, he would prove himself worthy of the throne he sought to claim. He had come a long way from the boy who had dreamed of glory in the fields of his youth. Now, he was a king in the making, and the world would soon learn whether he had the strength to rule. The tension in the air was palpable as the young monarch walked through the grand halls of his new stronghold, the stone walls echoing with every step he took. There was an unfamiliar weight in the quiet that followed him, one that had settled in the very marrow of his bones. It was not the weight of war, nor the burden of conquest. It was something more insidious, something that had taken root within the very heart of his court. The atmosphere was thick with distrust, a feeling he had never anticipated when he had first set his eyes on the throne. For years, he had fought with everything he had, driven by the belief that his destiny was one of greatness, that the path he walked would ultimately lead to the restoration of a kingdom that had long been forgotten by its rulers. And yet, now that he had come so close to achieving everything he had ever wanted, he found himself surrounded by a new kind of battle, one that was not fought on the fields of war, but within the walls of his own court. The internal strife was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a faint murmur in a crowded room. But as the days passed, the murmur grew louder, and what had once been whispers behind closed doors soon became open conflict. It began with the lords, the powerful men who controlled vast tracts of land, wealth, and influence. At first, they had welcomed him, seeing in his rise the promise of change, the potential for a better future. They had pledged their loyalty to him, driven by their own desires for power and status. But as his influence grew, so did their uncertainty. They began to question whether the young monarch, a man who had once been nothing more than a warrior from the fringes of the kingdom, could truly rule. They whispered about his origins, about his lack of noble blood, about his ability to command not just an army, but a kingdom. Some began to think that perhaps he was too ambitious, too willing to tear down the very structures that had sustained the kingdom for centuries. Others wondered whether his rise had been the result of luck rather than skill, and whether a man who had won battles with the strength of his sword could truly understand the complexities of governance. The young monarch was not blind to these growing sentiments. He had seen the subtle shifts in the behavior of his court, the way the nobles began to treat him with a thinly veiled condescension, as though his rise to power had been a temporary aberration, one that could be easily undone. He had come to understand that power in the court was not just a matter of military might or brute strength. It was a matter of perception, of alliances, and of who could outmaneuver whom. And here, in the heart of his own domain, he was no longer the conqueror. He was just another man trying to hold on to what he had gained, and the challenge of holding the throne was beginning to feel like a war in itself. His closest advisors, men who had fought alongside him and bled with him on the battlefield, were now at odds. They had their own ambitions, their own visions of what the kingdom should become. And as the young monarch navigated the treacherous waters of court politics, he realized that he could no longer rely solely on the men who had once been his comrades in arms. Each of them now had their own stake in the game, their own goals, and the lines between friend and foe were becoming increasingly blurred. One of his most trusted generals, a man who had once stood by him through the darkest of times, had begun to pull away. At first, the young monarch had assumed it was simply the exhaustion of a long campaign taking its toll, but as the weeks passed, he began to notice a change in the man's demeanor. The general no longer looked him in the eye as he once had. He no longer spoke with the same conviction, the same loyalty. The monarch knew better than to ignore the signs. This man, who had once been a steadfast ally, was now distancing himself, and the reasons were unclear. Had the general begun to question his rule? Was he looking to align himself with other factions, waiting for the right moment to strike? Or was it something else entirely, some personal ambition that had driven him to reconsider his place at the young monarch's side? The suspicion festered within him, gnawing at his thoughts. He knew that the general had never been entirely comfortable with the idea of a warrior king, someone who had come from nothing, suddenly taking control of a kingdom that had once been ruled by noble bloodlines. Could this be the source of his growing discontent? Or was it a matter of pure politics, an attempt to consolidate power and prepare for the inevitable power struggles that came with being part of the inner circle of a young and untested ruler? As the days wore on, the fractures within the court grew deeper. What had once been a carefully constructed alliance of factions began to crumble, each man vying for influence, each plotting to secure his place in the new world order that the young monarch was trying to build. There were subtle maneuvers, whispers of rebellion here, promises of support there, but the true nature of the conflict was harder to discern. In the midst of all this intrigue, the monarch found himself feeling more isolated than ever. He had fought battles on the field, led men into the fray, but this was a different kind of war, a war for control over not just the land, but the very soul of the kingdom. At night, when the palace was quiet and the corridors echoed with the sounds of distant footsteps, the young monarch would often retreat to his chambers, his mind racing with the impossible task ahead. How could he restore order to a court that was fracturing before his very eyes? How could he secure the loyalty of men who had once fought alongside him, but now looked at him with distrust in their eyes? The cost of leadership, he realized, was not just measured in bloodshed, but in the subtle betrayals, the quiet compromises, and the constant battle to hold on to power. He had never imagined that this quiet, insidious war would be his greatest challenge. In the midst of the uncertainty, he turned to those who had stood by him since the beginning. The old warriors, the men who had seen him through the worst of times, still offered him counsel. But even their advice felt strained, as though they, too, were uncertain of what the future held. They had helped him build an army, helped him win battles, but they were not skilled in the ways of politics. They were soldiers, not statesmen, and they could not give him the answers he needed. He had no choice but to navigate this alone, to trust his instincts and his understanding of the world he had come to know. The stakes were higher now, and the price of failure was not just his life. It was the future of the kingdom itself. The monarch's heart grew heavier with each passing day. He had faced the brutality of battle, the loss of men who had fought beside him. But this was different. This was the slow, grinding pressure of power slipping through his fingers, the constant feeling that his grip on the kingdom was weakening, no matter how hard he tried to hold it. The walls of the palace, once a symbol of his victory, now felt like a prison. The lavish halls that had once celebrated his rise were now a reminder of all that was at stake. He could not afford to fail. He could not afford to lose the loyalty of his men, his generals, or the very kingdom he had fought so hard to claim. It was not just a matter of holding power. It was a matter of proving that he was worthy of it. He had been a warrior, a conqueror, but now he had to be something else. He had to be a ruler, a king who could command not just armies, but the hearts and minds of those who surrounded him. If he failed, if he allowed the internal strife to tear his kingdom apart, all of his sacrifices, all of his victories would have been for nothing. And so, he steeled himself, ready to confront whatever came next. He had fought for this throne, and he would not let it slip away without a fight. As he sat in the silence of his chambers, looking out over the kingdom he had fought to reclaim, he knew that the true battle was only just beginning. The kingdom was fractured, but was not yet lost. He would face the treachery, the deceit, and the rebellion head-on. He would show his men and the world that he was more than just a warrior. He was a king, and his reign was only beginning. The days of uncertainty had stretched long, and the weight of power had begun to take its toll. The young monarch, now firmly seated at the helm of his fractured kingdom, could feel the constant pressure bearing down upon him. Each decision, each move, felt like a delicate step across a fragile bridge, threatening to collapse at any misstep. His mind had been sharpened by years of warfare, yet the complexities of ruling were proving to be a different kind of battlefield altogether. It was one that could not be conquered with the same strategies, nor could victory be measured in the bloodshed of battle. As the monarch looked out over the land that was now his to command, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the land itself, vast, divided, and filled with competing ambitions. The kingdom was a patchwork of loyalties, some genuine, others forged out of necessity, and still others driven by ambition or old rivalries. It had taken years to get to this point, to claim the throne through sheer will and unrelenting strength. But now he faced a new challenge, one that would require more than just the sword. It would require the forging of alliances, the smoothing over of old wounds, and the careful management of people who had only ever known war and discord. The monarch knew that his greatest asset now was not the strength of his army or the might of his sword, but the loyalty of those around him. His army, though formidable, was no longer enough to hold the kingdom together. The real battle was won for the hearts and minds of the nobles, the influential figures who held the true power within the kingdom. His victory had not brought him peace. It had only begun to unravel the deep-seated divisions that ran through the heart of the realm. In the weeks following his consolidation of power, the monarch set to work securing his position. He knew that to truly rule, he had to first secure the loyalty of those who had once stood against him. This meant not only maintaining the loyalty of his generals, but also winning over those who were unsure of his leadership, those who saw him as a threat to their own power. It was a delicate balancing act, and one that required him to navigate the labyrinth of political maneuvering with care. He began by reaching out to the more moderate lords, those who had not openly opposed his rise to power, but had remained neutral, sitting on the sidelines as the events of the past unfolded. These lords were the key to solidifying his rule, for their support could lend him the legitimacy he needed to solidify his claim to the throne. But winning their favor would not be easy. The monarch knew that they were cautious, distrustful, and unwilling to commit until they were certain of the future. It was in these early meetings that he began to see the true nature of the challenge before him. The political landscape was a maze, filled with rivalries that ran deep, long-held grudges that would not be easily erased, and men whose ambitions burned as fiercely as his own. In his attempts to win allies, he found that the most effective approach was not force, but negotiation. The monarch had spent years learning the art of strategy on the battlefield, but here, in the court, he would need to learn a different set of skills. He began to realize that his greatest weapon was not his sword, but his ability to listen, to understand the needs and desires of those around him. At the heart of his approach was a realization that was as simple as it was profound. He could not rule by fear alone. To create a kingdom that would endure, he needed to forge genuine connections, to build a sense of trust and loyalty that extended beyond mere survival. He needed to create a vision for the future, one that everyone could see themselves in, whether they were a noble or a commoner. It would not be enough to simply hold the throne. He had to build something worth preserving. In those early days of consolidation, the monarch began to weave a complex web of alliances, offering land and titles to those who pledged their loyalty, while quietly undermining those who sought to oppose him. His strategy was not to crush his enemies entirely, but to neutralize them, turning potential threats into allies, or at least into neutral parties. He began to foster a sense of unity among his supporters, drawing them closer by offering them a stake in the future of the kingdom. With every passing day, his influence grew, and slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. But even as the monarch took steps to solidify his power, he knew that the kingdom's internal divisions were not easily healed. He had won battles, and he had conquered lands, but the true test of his reign would be in his ability to bring together a people who had been torn apart by years of conflict. His army, though loyal, was composed of men who had been forged in the fires of war, men who knew only the language of violence. And while they would follow him in battle, he knew that the future of the kingdom depended on more than just military strength. It was here, in the heart of the kingdom, that the young monarch's leadership would truly be tested. He had to build bridges where none had existed before, to create a sense of unity where there had been only division. His task was not just to rule, but to heal, to bind together the fractured pieces of a kingdom that had been torn apart by years of strife and war. And to do so, he would need more than just power. He would need wisdom, patience, and the ability to inspire those around him to believe in the future he envisioned. The first signs of success came when several influential lords, once wary of his rule, began to pledge their loyalty to him in earnest. Their support, while not universal, lent him the legitimacy he so desperately needed. With each new ally, his position grew stronger and his vision for the future began to take shape. But the path forward was not without obstacles. As the monarch worked to solidify his rule, he was faced with the constant challenge of keeping his allies in check, ensuring that none of them became too powerful or sought to undermine his authority. He knew that even the smallest crack in the unity he had worked so hard to build could cause everything to collapse. The monarch's growing influence was not without its costs, however. As he worked to unite the kingdom, he began to realize that the price of leadership was not simply in political maneuvering or the wielding of power. The true cost of his rise was measured in the sacrifices he had made, and the sacrifices he would continue to make. He had spent years on the battlefield, leading men into war, but now he found himself leading men through the complexities of governance, of ensuring that loyalty and trust were not just words, but the foundation of his rule. His own sense of self, once clear and unwavering, had begun to blur. He had been a warrior, driven by the need to prove himself, to carve out his place in history. But now, As a ruler, he was forced to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was becoming. The weight of the crown pressed down on him with a new intensity, and the fear of failure gnawed at his thoughts. Every decision, every move was fraught with consequences, some immediate, others far-reaching. He could no longer afford to be impulsive or driven solely by instinct. He needed to think with clarity and wisdom, for the future of his kingdom was now in his hands. Despite the challenges, the monarch found a sense of purpose in his efforts to unite the kingdom. He began to see that his true power lay not in his military conquests, but in his ability to shape the future, to create a vision that others could believe in. The foundation of his rule would not be built on bloodshed, but on the shared hope of a better tomorrow, one where the people could live in peace and prosperity. In the weeks that followed, the monarch's efforts began to bear fruit. The internal conflicts that had once seemed insurmountable began to resolve themselves, and the kingdom began to take shape as something greater than the sum of its parts. The nobles, once fragmented and distrustful, began to work together under his guidance, united by a common goal: the survival and prosperity of the realm. And while challenges still remained, the young monarch could feel the momentum building, the sense of purpose growing stronger with each passing day. The path ahead was not easy, and the road to true unity would be long and fraught with difficulty. But as the monarch looked out over the lands he had fought to reclaim, he knew that he was on the right path. The foundation had been laid, the pieces were falling into place, and the future, though uncertain, was no longer a distant dream. It was within his grasp. And in that moment, he understood something fundamental. The true legacy of a king was not in the wars he won or the lands he conquered, but in the peace and stability he built for his people. The weight of the throne had grown heavier with each passing day, and with it, the realization that ruling was not simply about wielding power. It was about the careful orchestration of every aspect of a kingdom, from the smallest decision to the grandest vision. The monarch, having fought tirelessly for his place at the top, now found himself caught in a labyrinth of politics, diplomacy, and the fragile threads of loyalty that bound his reign together. Each day brought new challenges, new pressures, and new doubts, but also an increasing sense that the road ahead, though treacherous, could lead to something far greater than he had ever imagined. His kingdom, though secured, was still fragile, a patchwork of territories and loyalties that could easily unravel if not carefully managed. The people, the true heartbeat of the realm, were weary. They had witnessed endless years of conflict, and though the monarch had brought a semblance of order, the scars of the past still lingered. Trust in leadership was not easily earned, and while his rise had been marked by victory and determination, he understood that the road to true stability would not be paved by the sword alone. It would require a careful blend of diplomacy, reform, and most of all, the ability to listen to the concerns of those he ruled. The monarch's vision had always been one of unity, a kingdom not divided by faction or war, but one where the people could live in peace, prosper, and rebuild what had been lost. But even as he worked tirelessly to secure his reign, he knew that this vision was not shared by all. There were factions within the kingdom, old rivalries that still simmered beneath the surface, and nobles whose ambitions were as strong as ever. The monarch had dealt with these tensions before, through subtle alliances and calculated moves, but the cracks in the kingdom were starting to grow wider, and the challenges were becoming harder to ignore. The first signs of true dissent came quietly, in the form of small uprisings and whispered rebellions. A noble in the eastern provinces, once a staunch ally, had begun to raise troops under the guise of defending the kingdom's honor. He spoke of a rightful return to the old ways, of a need to preserve the traditional power structures that had been in place long before the monarch's rise. It was clear that this noble, who had initially pledged his loyalty to the crown, was now seeking to carve out his own domain, to challenge the monarch's authority under the pretense of protecting the realm. At first, it seemed a minor threat, an isolated act of defiance that could be quickly quashed. But the monarch knew better. This was no isolated incident. It was the first tremor of something larger, a warning that the stability he had fought so hard for could easily slip through his fingers. The response to this threat required more than just military strength. It required finesse. The monarch called upon his most trusted advisors, including the few who had been with him from the beginning, to formulate a plan that would not only deal with the rebellion, but also prevent future uprisings. The goal was not simply to crush the dissent, but to understand its root causes. What drove men like this noble to rise against the crown? Was it a matter of personal ambition, or was it a reflection of deeper dissatisfaction with the way the kingdom was being governed? The more the monarch considered the situation, the more he realized that this rebellion was not just about one man's thirst for power. It was about a larger feeling of disenfranchisement that had spread across the land. There were many in the kingdom who still felt disconnected from the new order. The peasantry, in particular, had not felt the benefits of peace, and many of the smaller lords were still clinging to the old ways, unwilling to adapt to the new structure of power. These were the fractures he had been too preoccupied to see clearly, the silent, festering wounds that threatened to tear the kingdom apart if left untreated. He knew that the only way to address this was through reform. It would not be enough to defeat the rebellion on the battlefield. He needed to address the root causes of unrest, to create a system that allowed all people, regardless of their station, to feel that they had a stake in the future of the kingdom. The monarch had always understood the importance of loyalty, but now he began to see that loyalty was not something that could be demanded. It was something that had to be earned, day by day, through careful leadership and meaningful change. With this new understanding, he set about making changes to the kingdom's structure. He began by seeking the counsel of those who had long been on the fringes of power, men and women who had been excluded from the decision-making process, whose voices had been ignored in favor of the powerful nobility. The monarch knew that by broadening the circle of influence, by allowing a greater diversity of voices to be heard, he could create a more balanced and fair system of governance. It was a risk, to be sure, but one he was willing to take if it meant securing the loyalty of the people and preventing further uprisings. As the monarch worked to implement these reforms, he also faced the difficult task of dealing with the rebellious noble in the East. This man, once a trusted ally, had taken to rallying his forces with impassioned speeches, claiming that the monarch's rule was weakening the kingdom, eroding the traditions that had kept it strong. To defeat him, the monarch knew that he could not simply rely on force. He needed to show the people that his vision for the future was not one of destruction, but of progress. The battle for the heart of the kingdom was not one that could be won by armies alone. It would be won by ideas. The monarch sent emissaries to the rebel noble, proposing a meeting to discuss the future of the kingdom and the role the noble could play in it. It was a risky move, one that could be seen as a sign of weakness. But the monarch understood that the true test of his leadership was not in his ability to conquer, but in his ability to negotiate, to bring people together even in the face of opposition. He needed to show the kingdom that he was not just a conqueror, but a ruler who understood the complexities of leadership and was willing to compromise for the greater good. To his surprise, the noble agreed to the meeting. The two men sat across from each other in a room filled with tension. The monarch could see the fire in the noble's eyes, the same fire that had once fueled his own rise to power. But this time, it was not a fire for unity. It was a fire for division. The noble spoke of a return to the old ways, of the need to restore the balance of power that had existed before the monarch had taken the throne. The monarch listened patiently, hearing the frustration in the noble's voice. He knew that this rebellion was not about personal gain, but about a deep-seated belief that the kingdom's future was in jeopardy. The monarch did not respond with threats or anger. Instead, he spoke of his vision for the future, of a kingdom that could thrive through unity and reform. He spoke of the challenges that the kingdom faced, but also of the opportunities that lay ahead. He promised that the old ways would not be abandoned, but that the kingdom could adapt and evolve without losing its identity. It was a delicate balance, but it was the only way forward. The noble listened, and for the first time, the monarch saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The meeting ended without a resolution, but it marked a turning point. The monarch knew that this was not the end of the conflict, but the beginning of a new phase in his reign. He had shown the noble that he was not simply a conqueror, but a leader who was willing to listen and to adapt. The kingdom, though still fractured, was beginning to heal. And as the monarch looked out over the lands he had fought so hard to reclaim, he knew that the road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges. But it was a road that was now paved with the possibility of something greater. The rebellion in the east would not be the last of its kind, but it would be the first that the monarch had faced with a clear sense of purpose. He had learned that the true strength of a king was not in his ability to destroy his enemies, but in his ability to unite his people, to create a vision for the future that inspired loyalty and trust. And with that understanding, he knew that the kingdom could survive, could thrive, and could one day become the great empire he had always dreamed of, if only he could continue to lead with wisdom, patience, and a heart devoted to the greater good. The monarch stood on the balcony of his castle, gazing over the vast expanse of the kingdom he had fought to claim. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape that had once been marred by conflict and bloodshed. Now, the land seemed peaceful, quiet, as if the scars of war had faded beneath the passage of time. Yet, despite the serenity of the scene before him, the monarch could feel a growing tension beneath the surface. The peace he had won was fragile, not yet fully realized. The fractures in his kingdom, though less obvious, still lingered, and he knew that the true test of his reign was not in the battles he had fought, but in the peace he had yet to secure. Over the course of his rise to power, the monarch had learned the harsh reality of leadership. His strength had always come from his ability to fight, to lead armies, and overcome adversaries. But now, as king, he found himself struggling with a different kind of warfare, a warfare fought not with weapons, but with words, alliances, and the delicate balancing of power. He had learned that ruling was a constant act of negotiation, that the throne he had so fiercely sought was not a place of absolute control, but one where compromises were often made in the shadows, where every decision came with its own consequences, and where every victory was tempered by the knowledge that there was always more to be done. In the early days of his reign, the monarch had believed that unity could be achieved through force, that his sword would be the instrument that held the kingdom together. But as time wore on, he began to realize that his kingdom, built on the ashes of war, was more fragile than he had imagined. The great lords of the land, those who had sworn fealty to him in the heat of battle, were now more difficult to control. Many of them had been brought together by the need to survive, by the threat of a common enemy. But in the aftermath of victory, the unity they had shared was beginning to fray. Each lord had his own ambitions, his own vision for the future, and now that the monarch had secured his position, these men were beginning to test the limits of his authority. It was in the northern reaches of his kingdom that the first real signs of discord began to emerge. The northern lords, whose loyalty had once been unquestionable, began to grow restless. They had long been used to ruling their own territories with little interference from the crown, and the monarch's rise had disrupted the established order. Though they had pledged their allegiance to him, they saw his power as a threat to their own, and their discontent began to show in small, subtle ways. Some began to hoard their resources, refusing to send the taxes and tribute that were due to the crown. Others withdrew their support for the monarch's reforms, insisting that they were too radical, too disruptive of the old ways. The once loyal northern lords were now quietly questioning whether they would remain faithful to the king, or whether it was time to reclaim the power they had lost. The monarch knew that this rebellion, though still in its infancy, could not be ignored. The northern lords were too powerful, too entrenched in their ways, and if they were allowed to grow in strength, they could easily unravel everything he had built. Yet he also understood that the key to dealing with them was not simply to apply force as he had done in the past, but to engage them on a deeper level. He needed to understand the root of their discontent, to offer them something that would allow them to feel secure in their place within the new order. It was a delicate task, one that would require all of his skill in diplomacy, patience, and understanding. He called for a council to address the issue, gathering his most trusted advisors to discuss the growing unrest in North. The council was filled with men who had fought beside him on the battlefield, but now, in a more staid atmosphere of governance, their skills were less valuable. The challenges they faced now were of a different nature, requiring careful strategy rather than brute force. The monarch listened to their suggestions, but he found that none of them had a solution that resonated with him. They spoke of sending armies north, of punishing the lords who had begun to stray from the crown's authority, but the monarch knew that this approach would only fuel the fire of rebellion. He had learned the hard way that violence, though effective in the short term, often sowed the seeds of further conflict. Instead, the monarch turned inward, reflecting on the lessons he had learned over the course of his journey. He had won his kingdom through sheer determination, through force and strategy, but he now understood that his reign could not be sustained through these means alone. He needed to win the hearts of his people, to secure their loyalty not by fear, but by offering them a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. And so, he devised a new plan, one that would involve not just the lords of the north, but the common people who lived in their territories. He would show them that his reign was not a threat, but a promise that their lands would prosper, that their way of life could continue, but only if they worked with him, not against him. The monarch's plan was bold, and it required him to take risks that he had never taken before. He would travel to the northern territories himself, meeting with the lords and speaking directly to the people. He would offer them a choice, to continue as they had, in defiance of the crown, or to accept a new way forward, one that would involve compromise, collaboration, and mutual benefit. He knew that this would not be an easy journey. He was walking into the heart of rebellion, into the very lands where his authority had begun to crumble. But it was the only way to ensure that the kingdom remained intact. If he failed, if he could not win the support of the northern lords and the people who followed them, his kingdom would be divided, and all of his efforts would have been for nothing. The journey to the north was long and arduous, and the monarch could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing on his shoulders with every step he took. He knew that the risks were great, but he also understood that the rewards could be just as significant. When he arrived in the northern territories, he was greeted not with the cheers and celebrations that had marked his earlier victories, but with a cold reception. The lords, though not openly hostile, regarded him with suspicion, as if waiting to see what he would do next. The people, too, seemed wary, as if unsure of what to make of the monarch who had once been a distant figure in their lives, a warrior they had heard of but never truly known. The monarch wasted no time in beginning his work. He met with the northern lords first, in the great halls of their castles, where the air was thick with tension. The lords were guarded, their faces betraying little emotion as they listened to him speak. He offered them his hand, not as a conqueror, but as a leader who understood their concerns. He promised them that their autonomy would not be stripped away, that they would continue to govern their lands as they always had, but only if they worked together with the crown, rather than in opposition to it. He spoke of the kingdom's future, of the need for unity, and the benefits that would come from a united front. He appealed to their pride, to their desire for a legacy that would outlive them. And slowly, piece by piece, the wall of suspicion began to crumble. Next, he turned to the common people, who had long lived in the shadow of the lords. He traveled to the villages and towns of the north, speaking directly to the farmers, artisans, and merchants who made up the heart of the region. He listened to their grievances, to their fears that the new order would leave them behind. And, as he had done with the lords, he offered them his vision, a kingdom where they had a stake, where their voices could be heard, and where their futures were tied to the prosperity of the realm. He promised them reforms, initiatives that would address their needs and help them thrive in the changing world. In return, he asked for their support, their loyalty, and their trust.